Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Hebrews chapter 11.
Good morning.
And also Genesis, which is where obviously we'll be spending more of our time. Today we'll be looking at the faith of Jacob. And like Isaac before him, the author of Hebrews only really gives us one verse, and referring really to just one event in Jacob's life that we're going to talk about. So obviously it's funny because even though we're talking about Jacob this week, the faith of Jacob, last week's session was the faith of Isaac, but we ended up spending most of our time talking about Jacob because so we've really already met Jacob and we've already really learned a lot about him because last week's story kind of revolved around him. And so like Isaac, as I said, the author only gives us one verse about Jacob, and he kind of speaks of him, and I mentioned this last week because it was the same with Isaac, speaks of him sort of like a transitionary figure where between Abraham and Moses in the covenant. And obviously, the author of Hebrews gives most of his time in chapter 11 to Abraham and Moses, and I think there's some significant reasons for that. And when we get to Moses, I'll talk more about that. But I think clearly those are his focuses. Foci, is that actually the word? Is that how you say it?
Focal points?
I think there's actually a plural, foci or foci or something like that. I don't care. Anyway,
Focal points.
Focal points.
There you go.
So anyway, he mentions Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, frankly, really just in passing with like a verse each, and doesn't really give us a lot about their lives. So that's the way we're going to kind of look at it. But at the same time, I think it's no accident why he chooses this particular event in Jacob's life to focus on. So obviously he doesn't give us the whole life of Jacob. He's only given us this one event. And in some ways, I think that's probably valid because as we look at the life of Jacob, there's a lot to question about the life of Jacob. He's not necessarily the way he lived his whole life. It's maybe not exactly an example of the best decisions and moral and ethical choices that he makes. And I'll circle back around to this point at the end. But what I think the life of Jacob does show us is that regardless of the bad choices he made during his life and the mistakes he made during his life, which there certainly were, when it came to the end, he believed in God at the end. And he placed his faith in God and God's plan and God's working in and through his life. And when it came to the end, he displayed faith in God, regardless of his earlier life. So it kind of, in a way, this particular session about Jacob, it mirrors a lot of what we talked about with Isaac. Because when we talked about Isaac, the focus was on the fact that he was giving his blessing to his son Jacob. Well, the same thing is true here. In the life of Jacob, what we're going to focus on is him giving the blessing to his son Joseph, and as we're going to see, predominantly Joseph's sons. So it's almost like, even though this is Jacob's verse, it's like we're going to talk as much about Joseph as we are going to about Jacob. Now, of course, we can't talk about everything that was their lives because of how much material we're talking about. But anyway, what Jacob's place in this line of blessing is significant, not just because he passed on the blessing, but because of the way he did it and how it went against normal customs and expectations. And it continues to develop that theme we talked about last week about how in God's plan, oftentimes he uses the weaker or the lesser to affect his plans rather than what we would do. He kind of does it the opposite way. And so we're going to see that here in the life of Jacob and his blessing of his sons. So, the life of Jacob covers pretty much half of the book of Genesis, so that's why I'm saying we can only hit the highlights here. the temptation, of course, is to just ignore everything and just look at the one verse that the author of Hebrews talks about. And that is where I want to spend most of our time, in that one event. But you really need the context of what led up to that, and what put Jacob and Joseph in the places they were when what happened in Genesis 48, which is what the author of Hebrews is referring to, happens. You kind of have to know what led up to that. But at the same time, just like with Isaac, we're talking virtually half the book of Genesis. We could spend months just on this. So I really can only, at this point, just mention the highlights. So obviously I'll be leaving a lot of details out, but the first section of this we kind of already know about, because it's what we talked about last week, his birth and early life. We know he was the son of Isaac and Rebekah. He was the younger twin brother of Esau, and from the very beginning they had a rivalry. And it was fueled in part by Jacob's own actions of manipulating his older brother to get him to give him his birthright, and then later on through the machinations of his mom and to deceive his father to get the primary elder son blessing. And that was essentially what we already talked about last week, so we already kind of know about all that. But what it tells us is, in the very beginning, Jacob was a manipulator and he was a deceiver. And I think that's ironic when you find out some of what happens to him later. Mm-hmm. So in Genesis 25 and 20 through 28 is where we essentially see this that we talked about last week. But at the end, in Genesis chapter 28, the part we really didn't talk about last week is where we see Jacob leaving Beersheba, where the family was living at that time, for a place called Haran. And what this was is, I kind of jumped over this verse last week because it was more relevant this week than last week. But when Isaac gave Jacob the second blessing, you remember the first blessing was the one he did under false pretenses when he thought it was Esau. But then later on, he blessed him anyway, even knowing it was him, and gave him the covenantal blessing. Well, as part of that, he also told Jacob that you're the chosen son now. You're going to be the patriarch of the family. You have an obligation to find the right wife to perpetuate, our descendants and everything. But he says, I do not want you to find a wife here among the Canaanites. I want you to go back to your mother's family area, which is where Haran was. And I want you to pick a wife from your mother's family. I know that makes us feel a little icky, thinking about that now, but you got to understand, you're talking about a distant cousin he's talking about, and it was not unusual and was not considered a taboo in those days. Honestly, really, even up to just the last century or two, was it considered a taboo to marry within cousins. I mean, even as recently as maybe the 19th century, it was not that unusual for cousins to marry. So this was not that big of a taboo, because that's essentially what he's talking about. Find a cousin from your mother's family and marry there. So Jacob does what he says, and he leaves and he goes to this area called Haran to find a wife. And on the way, this is where he has this vision in his dreams where God appears to him. This is where he sees in the dream he sees the stairway. Sometimes
Jacob's ladder.
Yeah, Jacob's ladder,
Yeah.
I think is the way King James Version translates. Mm-hmm. The NIV is the ladder, the stairway. And he sees the angels going up and down, but God himself appears to him and essentially restates the Abrahamic covenant to him. And so in this way, God is confirming the choice of Jacob as the chosen son. And I think that's really important to remember about Jacob, because even though we made a big deal last week about how the whole thing happened because of the deceiving of Isaac, and it did, but you remember how we talked last week that even though that was a deception and it was certainly a sin and it was the wrong way to do things, God still intended it to be that way. God still used the outcome of that to affect his promise and his covenant. And in this chapter is where he actually, God confirms that that was his plan, because even though his father Isaac has already given him the fatherly elder son blessing, God directly speaks to Jacob and said, I am confirming that covenant with you. I am blessing you and your descendants and make a great nation of you and give you the land that, that you're living in will be your possession forever. And he confirms that covenant with him, thus confirming that that was God's plan all along. So no matter what Jacob and Rebekah did, it did not frustrate God's plan. It did not change God's plan. It was God's plan, despite their messing it up with their actions. So I think it's a really important thing to remember. So he has that encounter basically on his way. Then upon arriving in Haran, Jacob meets Rachel, who is the son of this man named Laban, and he instantly falls in love with her. And it's not just an infatuation. When you see how all the way to the end of Rachel's life, he truly, genuinely, desperately loves Rachel. And you see what all he did to win her. He genuinely loved Rachel. And so he agrees to work as a servant, essentially an indentured servant, sort of a kind of almost voluntary slavery that he puts himself under to work for Laban for 7 years to have the privilege of marrying Rachel. Here's the irony of it, though. At the end of the 7 years, when he ostensibly is able to marry Rachel now, Laban deceives him and sends into him on their honeymoon night his elder daughter, Rachel's sister, Leah, instead, because Leah was the eldest. Now, how Jacob falls for this, I don't know, maybe just because it was dark. I'm assuming that's why, because he doesn't discover it till the next day that it was actually Leah he was with and not Rachel. So I guess because it was in the dark of night, the only explanation of how he could be fooled by that, but he was. And the next morning, when he realizes that he's been deceived, sometimes be careful, your sin will come right around and bite you in the rear.
I think he was drunk.
Huh?
I think he was drunk.
Maybe.
She may have been wearing a veil too.
Maybe. Well, I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure it was dark. But anyway, so Jacob is furious at being deceived because he, loves Rachel, and that's who he wanted, and not Leah. But now Laban says, well, if you work for me another 7 years, you can have Rachel, and he doesn't. I mean, that's how, it shows how much he loved Rachel. He's willing to be essentially a slave again for another 7 years for the right to marry Rachel, and he does. So now Jacob has 2 wives and not 1. And so, again, sort of a questionable thing, but he honors both commitments for what that's worth. But Leah is actually the first to give him a son in Reuben. Reuben is the eldest, but not Rachel's. Reuben is Leah's. So I'm skipping a lot here, okay? But Jacob, of course, becomes the father of 4 sons. And here, again, we're talking about some questionable choices that they all make. Because not only does he have 2 wives, but the 2 wives have maidservants, and he has sons through them as well, because of deals made, and he goes along with it. And again, we're talking very questionable moral and ethical choices that he makes here. So he basically has 2 sons through Rachel's servant Bilhah. That's where Dan and Naphtali come from. Leah's servant Zilpah, Gad and Asher come from them. And then through Leah, he has, of course, the elder Reuben, plus Issachar, Zebulun, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and a daughter. He also has a daughter, Dinah. And then through Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. So out of all 12 of them, he only has 2 through his preferred wife, Rachel.
But notice those are his 2 favorite sons.
Those are his 2 favorite sons. Mm-hmm. But also, ironically, notice who Judah's mother was. And of course, you know the significance of Judah. Mm-hmm. That is the line of the Messiah. Mm-hmm. So it's not what we would expect. It is not what we would expect. We would expect, the Messiah maybe to come through Rachel's line, because that was his choice. or through Joseph. That was his favorite. But no, the Messiah came through Judah, who was the son of Leah. So I find that, once again, ironic. This whole situation is essentially a big soap opera. And if you read, and I'm only hitting the highlights, there's a lot there that you could go in and examine. But and none of this is what the author of Hebrews mentions. So clearly, this is not the part
because it's
where
a soap opera.
Yeah, this is not the part that shows Jacob's faith. Is my point.
Yeah.
So, and then of course we have this whole section that I'm not. It's not really relevant to what happens in Genesis 48. So I'm just kind of skipping over it. But of course we have Jacob's struggles with Esau that are the result of his own deception with his father and the enmity between he and Esau. That's all in Genesis and in 32 and 33. And of course it is also during this time that Jacob wrestles with the angel. Is during his struggles with Esau. And there's a lot more that could be said there. But then in Genesis 37, this is when we begin the part that really leads up to what the author of Hebrews is talking about, and that is Jacob's relationship with his son Joseph. So it's in Genesis 37 that we find out that Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. Now I know that a person can't help how they feel in their heart, but Jacob shows clear favoritism, displaying it openly towards Joseph. Now you would think
He would know better.
that if anybody
would understand that.
would know better than showing favoritism and what the ramifications and the results of showing favoritism can be, you would think it would be Jacob. But Jacob has a blind spot. And I'm not saying he doesn't have a right to, in his own mind and heart, say, Joseph is my favorite. But to show the favoritism openly by giving him this richly ornamented robe, which of course in the King James is the coat of many colors. But clearly whatever it is, it's like giving one son a tuxedo and the rest of them t-shirt and jeans. Clearly this shows favoritism to Joseph, and all the other sons, of course, saw that. And of course Joseph, in his naivety, doesn't help. Because Joseph, his gift, his spiritual gift, of course, is having dreams that are actually visions from God, and the interpretation of those. And of course that comes into play later in his life. It's his spiritual gift. So he has a dream that shows in the dream and the way it's interpreted that all of his brothers are going to bow down before him. Well, it's bad enough to have that dream and maybe even tell your dad about it, but he tells them about it. I'm sorry, I don't know, that just shows a little bit of naivety to me. Because why would you tell them that? Why would you think that they would react toward that in any way other than resentment?
Well, they already resented
They
him.
already resent him. It's
Yeah.
just fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
Oh, guess what? Reuben and Asher and Issachar and all that, you're all going to bow down before me one day. And he not realize that's going to somehow affect his relationship with them. But anyway, so he does, and so obviously they hate him to the point where they want to kill him. And of course they deceive him and take him out to the wilderness and they throw him in a pit. And they're originally just going to leave him to die. But eventually decide, no, we shouldn't do that. Instead, let's sell him into slavery. So they sell him to Ishmaelite merchants as basically a slave. And then they deceive Jacob. Jacob once again becomes the victim of deceit by slaying an animal and covering the coat of many colors, the richly ornamented robe with the animal blood, and taking it back to Jacob and saying he got killed and mauled by an animal. So not only is they're deceiving Jacob, but of course now Jacob thinks he's lost his favorite son. And so he's, of course, dejected about that. And somehow I guess that gives the other brother some sense of, justice or something. I don't know. They got their way. But of course, that, once again, those evil, despicable, resentful acts set in motion what ends up rescuing the whole family.
And the nation.
And the nation. Because what happens with Joseph in Egypt, and this starts in Genesis chapter 38, he gets sold into slavery, but the particular family that buys him is the guy that his senior advisor, a guy named Potiphar. Essentially, he's the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. So I guess you could say he's kind of like being the head of the Secret Service in a way. But that's the family he gets sold into slavery from. Well, at this particular point, Pharaoh starts having visions in dreams that he doesn't understand, and he hears that his captain of his guard has a slave that's really good at interpreting dreams. So he brings Joseph in, and Joseph immediately interprets the dreams. There's a coming famine, but you've got time, and here's what we need to do to prepare for it. And Pharaoh is so impressed that he basically turns Joseph essentially into what you call a prime minister. He basically says, you bow to no one but me.
He literally went from the prison to the penthouse.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
So he becomes essentially the assistant pharaoh, or like I said, what you call essentially a prime minister. He puts him in charge. And so Joseph basically rescues, as you said, the nation, because during the time of plenty, they stock up on grain and everything, and then when the famine comes, not only do they have enough to share and to sell, and Egypt actually prospers from it. So, ironically, we would consider, of course, but it's all part of God's plan, this famine and Egypt's ability to provide during this time is what brings Jacob's family to Egypt. And so they come in order to buy grain because Egypt has plenty, in order to save the starving family during this time of famine. Well, there's a whole nother story on how that occurs, and it itself is an interesting story, but it's the life of Joseph and not Jacob. So I'm skipping over all of that, but the bottom line is that Jacob is brought to Egypt, and once they all discover who they are, and identities are revealed, and they realize this is Joseph, and Joseph invites them all to come with Pharaoh's blessing back to Egypt, and Jacob is reunited with Joseph and realizes that not only did he not lose his son, but now he has grandsons. So this brings us to Genesis 48, and this is the context in which this happens, where Jacob pronounces his blessing. So again, I've skipped a lot, but I've just tried to give us the highlights to show how we got from Isaac to here, and how we get to the event that the author of Hebrews wrote about in 11:21, and that is Jacob pronouncing his blessing. So what we have here, Genesis 48:1. Sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. And when Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel, and by this time, by the way, God has renamed Jacob Israel, given him that name. But during this passage, Moses kind of goes back and forth. Sometimes he calls him Jacob, sometimes he calls him Israel. It's interchangeable. "But your son Joseph has come to you." Israel rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. He was very elderly at this point, very weak at this point. In fact, the verse just prior to that, at the end of chapter 47, which also the Hebrews author refers to, is that he's so weak he had to have a staff to when he was standing up, to hold himself up, because he was that weak. But just like we talked about it when Isaac was old and realizing the time had come to give his blessing because he realized he didn't have much time left, Jacob comes to that same point. And he realizes his time is short. And it is time to do his fatherly duty in passing the covenantal blessing on to his sons. However, just as his father passed the blessing on to the younger son instead of the elder, Jacob is led, and clearly this is God's leading. It's not, capricious anyway, to pass his blessing not to Reuben, his eldest, but to Joseph, his second youngest. But that in itself, of course, is outside of what would be culturally normal and what would be expected. But what he does is even surprising in that regard, because he does something even beyond what just picking a younger son. So in verse 3 of chapter 48, Jacob says to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, I am going to make you fruitful and will increase your numbers, and I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you. So, in these verses, Jacob is telling Joseph how God pronounced the covenant directly upon him and his descendants. It's kind of the lead up to him doing the same thing for him. But I think it's also the recognition that regardless of what happened earlier, God did choose him as the avenue of the covenant. God spoke directly to him, like I alluded to before. Regardless of the deceiving and everything that went on earlier, God did choose him. And he promised him that not only he would be blessed, but his descendants would be blessed and would be given that land. In other words, the covenant that God made with our forefather Abraham is still in effect. It is still God's promise. It is still going on through me to you. So he continues on in verse 5 and says, Now then, your two sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours in the territory they inherit. They will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. So, you see what he has done here. He has taken Joseph's sons, his grandsons, and he has essentially, for lack of a better term, adopted them as his own sons. So now, from a legal standpoint, from an inheritance standpoint, from a significant standpoint, they are not just his grandsons, they are actually Jacob's sons. And that's not just something he's saying from an emotional standpoint, like I'm going to think of them as my own sons. This carries actual legal import. And the reason that I say that is when you go on to read the rest of the history in Exodus especially, and then into Joshua when it talks about the conquest and when they actually settled in the land, and they would talk about how this tribe would have this area, this tribe would have this land, this was given to this tribe. You see they refer to these tribes as the half-tribe of Manasseh and the half-tribe of Ephraim. They are actually given lands of their own in the land when the people inherit it after the conquest. None of Jacob's other grandsons, and there were many, if you go and look, there's a list earlier in Genesis of all of the other grandsons, none of them have that privilege. They essentially get a son's portion. So it shows how much not only Joseph is the favored son, but they are the favored grandsons over and above all the rest of their brothers. So this is an extremely significant thing, and that's why I'm saying this blessing, we tend to think of this as, the father's just praying for happiness and prosperity and safety and all for his descendants. No, this is something that actually has the force of law, even though there isn't really a law in place right now. But it nonetheless becomes valid from a legal standpoint, because Ephraim and Manasseh's descendants have their own portion of the land given to them. So it's very significant. Now in verse 9, as we move along, Israel said, "Bring them to me so that I may bless them." So Jacob is going to formalize this with essentially this ceremony that we've seen before, the laying on of hands. Just as Isaac laid his hands upon Jacob, Jacob is going to lay his hands upon those two boys, and that confers this upon them in a legally binding way. So that's the blessing that we've been leading up to all this time. Now in verse 10, the scripture tells us, "Now Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too.'" And I think that's part of, from an emotional standpoint, certainly that's part of what's motivated, I think, Jacob to just see this as some kind of special blessing from God. He feels that, before he felt that his favorite son was taken from him. But now God has not only given him his son, but allowed him to see his grandsons. So it's like a double, or maybe you might even say a triple blessing given to to Jacob. And I think Jacob is just emotionally overwhelmed with the grace of God, especially in light of all that he did, making mistakes of his own. God still is rewarding him with seeing his son that he thought he'd lost, and his grandsons. And he clearly sees God as at work. He's wise enough at this point in his life to see how through all of this, God has been at work to bring them to this place that they could never, ever have imagined that they could ever be in this position at this time. They could never have figured this out on their own. They could have never planned this. They could have never foreseen this without God. But God was at work, greatly blessing them, and he saw this apparently as a sign from God. So Joseph, he says in verse 13, took both of them, Ephraim on his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left toward Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. Now, this is significant because, as we've talked about before, talking culturally and what's expected from custom, the person on someone's right hand is always considered the most important. That's why a lot of times you talk in the New Testament, Jesus is always referred to as being at the right hand of God. Someone at the right hand of the king is always considered the one who's the most important, or the most special, or the most authority. Well, the same is true here when you're talking about these two sons or grandsons he's going to bless. The one on his right hand is the eldest, and that was Manasseh. So Joseph naturally assumed. So he brought the boys up to them in that way so that he could put his right hand on Manasseh the elder and his left hand on Ephraim the younger. So, to me, I don't know, I'm giggling because this just seems like, picturing this in my mind just seems funny to me, that when he does that, then Israel switches his hands over. It's like he's playing Twister, He does this awkward thing where he puts his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh, and to pronounce this blessing, like he was the eldest. So he kind of switched things up. So apparently subverting this normal custom. Well, we know that was deliberate, but Joseph didn't see it that way in the beginning. So then in verse 15, it says, "Then he blessed Joseph and said," May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly upon the earth. So it says that here in verse 15 that he blessed Joseph, but the content of the blessing all seems to be about the boys. So one of two things, either the specific blessing to Joseph wasn't recorded, or more likely, this is all just seen as the blessing to Joseph's sons is essentially a blessing to him as well, indirectly. And I think clearly Joseph would see it that way. If your children were blessed by your father, you would see that as a blessing through you. It's still a blessing for you, even if it eventually goes to the children. But what he says here, the content of the blessing, the pieces of it, first of all, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. Jacob identifies this God from whom the blessings are going to come. And remember, they're living in this pagan land of Egypt. And probably Manasseh and Ephraim they're just surrounded by paganism. That's all they've ever seen, other than what their father may have told them. So this blessing is clearly identifying and acknowledging this is the God of Abraham. This is the one true God, not the Egyptian gods that these boys are used to seeing. Now here's the other very interesting thing. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. This is where we are beginning to see the faith of Jacob that was weak or maybe even non-existent early in his life has now grown to the point where he can look back on his life and he can see how God worked in his life. And God was his shepherd. Now imagine for the moment, he is not stupid. He knows the bad choices he made in his life. He knows the things that he did. Yet he can see the hand of God as his shepherd in his life, leading him from where he started to where he is. So he now sees the hand of God in his life and has trusted that everything that happened was not an accident, but was God's plan from the beginning. And he also sees God as his protector, the angel. And you notice it's in capitals and in Scripture, indicating that he's seeing that as not just a random angel, but the angel of the Lord, probably referring to God himself, really. Has delivered me from all harm. There were many, many times when Jacob could have met his demise. Well, we could always say that, but especially with all that Jacob went through. You think about the things he encountered during his life. But yet, God kept him, preserved him, protected him, not only guided him, but kept him to this point where he could now live to an old age and see his son again and see his grandchildren. So may he, that is that God, not him, not Jacob, but God, may the God of Abraham bless these boys. So now he's extending this covenantal blessing directly to them. And then we see how he is adopting them into his own family as his own sons. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. So they become his direct heirs, as we said before, just like his other sons. They are adopted into his family directly. And then may they increase greatly upon the earth. And ultimately they will know the same promise of being fathers of great multitudes blessed by God. So they become, just like he was with his father, they become receivers of the Abrahamic covenant directly to them. But Jason, during all this, Joseph is looking and saying, whoa. Joseph saw his father place his right hand on Ephraim's head, and he was displeased. So Joseph felt like he had to help his father out. And to his credit, he knew his father couldn't see. They make a point of saying that his eyesight had failed. So I think that Joseph just thought his dad made a mistake and got confused over which child was which. So he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. and said, no, Dad, Manasseh's the older one. Ephraim's the younger one. So I think it's an understandable mistake. But his father refused and corrected him. And no, this was no mistake. And he said, I know, my son. I know. And here we have once again, as we talked about last week, God showing that the way we think of things and the way we plan things and the way we think things ought to happen are not the way God does things. He said, I know he too, that is the elder, will become a people. He too will become great. And he does, because Manasseh and his descendants do get their inheritance. But his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. So Jacob had not made a mistake. And just as he himself was the younger son, he is saying the younger son, Ephraim, will become the greater and get the elder blessing, although under different circumstances. So there was no way, of course, he could know this apart from God revealing it to him. So it was clear that this was his intention from the start. It was not a mistake. So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. So this was a change from custom and tradition, and definitely what Joseph would have intended or planned. But it was clearly part of God's plan and how he was leading Jacob. And he was utterly convinced of it, Jacob was. And so his decision would not be swayed. So it is this event that the author of Hebrews refers to in his single verse that he gives Jacob. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So this is the continuing theme, I think, we see here through this particular section, and we see it even into the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, and how Jesus taught us that God will exalt the weak and exalt the poor and exalt the humble, and he will bring down the proud and he will bring down the powerful. God just subverts the way we think of things. And so here he clearly directed that the younger son should receive the elder blessing. And it is this aspect of it that where we see Jacob's faith, trusting God, believing in what God was leading him to do and directing him to do. And despite all of his earlier mistakes, at the end, he trusted God and he obeyed God in this act of blessing. So this was an act, this blessing was we've talked about before, this was an act of obedience, but it was born out of and energized by his trusting in what God was leading him. Now, I think what we can clearly say is Jacob's life was not a life exemplifying great moral character. From the beginning, he was a manipulator. He was a partner in deception. He was a liar. He lied about, like his grandfather Abraham, he lied about Rachel being his wife. You remember, I skipped over that part. But he lied about Rachel being his wife at one point because he was afraid he'd be killed and somebody would steal Rachel from him. And of course, he became a polygamist. And so, yet, despite all of that, he was the descendant of Abraham and Isaac. And the covenant and the promises applied to him. And God did not break his promise and did not break his covenant, and nonetheless used the life of Jacob to further his plan for his people and ultimately for the redemption of mankind. Now we're told here, he mentions specifically in verse 21 that he worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff, and what that's referring to, and I didn't really mention it when we were back there, but in the very end of chapter 47, right before what we mentioned, this is when it says, Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness and do not bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they're buried. I will do as you say, he said. And then verse 31, swear to me, he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. That's the reference he's making to here. And then I think not only that, but in that beginning of his blessing, when you see Jacob exalting God, calling him his protector, calling him his shepherd, you see that despite all of his failures in his early life, he came to the point of he saw God's working in his life, and he worshiped God. He exalted God. He set aside his own failures and said, despite all that, God was my shepherd. And God has shown me grace in returning my son and showing me my grandsons. And so here I think is where we really see at the end Jacob's incredible faith to look past his own failures and see the grace of God in his life and the power of God in his life. And God being his shepherd and his protector, and Jacob worships and exalts God in the end. And that's the example that the author of Hebrews wants us to see, is no matter how much we may fail in our life, and no matter how bad we think we mess things up, God will still affect his plan in our life. We cannot derail God's plan in our life. We can't. I know we talked about that last week, but it was on my mind again this morning. There's been so many times over my life that I've talked to people who have been hesitant to do something in their spiritual life. It might just be, I really want to go to church, but my life is just too messy. I want to kind of clean my life up first and then go to church. I've talked to people before when I was like on the nominating committee, and I would talk to people about being like a Sunday school teacher or something like that. A lot of times I would hear the same kind of thing, like, I just don't think I'm ready for that right now because I'm just not faithful enough, or I'm not spiritually strong enough to teach anybody else. I think maybe I need to get my own life together first, and then I can think about teaching others. And then I've heard other people say even things like, I want to be baptized, but I just don't think I'm good enough. There's so many times that we think we are not good enough for God, or that God can't use us, or that I think maybe some of it might be fear that if we try and then we mess up and then it's our fault, God will be mad at us and punish us for messing up his plans. I think if anything, Jacob's life should be a shining light, exhibit A to us. That we're human and we have sin nature in us and we will make bad choices and we will make decisions. But if we're following God's plan and God's leading, it will not mess God's plan up. That God will work, sometimes despite us. Sometimes in spite of our mistakes, God will still take us to that place where we're supposed to be, and it's not going to upend God's plan. God will keep his promises. God will keep his covenant. And in the end, Jacob's faith was strong enough to be able to see that and to exalt God and worship God and obey God in passing that blessing to his son to show and display and manifest to everyone that God's covenant is real and that it is effective and that it will not be taken away, and he won't change his mind. It's unconditional. And that's just, to me, it's encouraging. To me, it's reassuring. To be a child of God, to be someone who's called to serve God in some limited capacity as much as I can, and sometimes knowing my own inabilities and weaknesses and mistakes, and realize I can't mess up God's plan, even if I mess up my life. And that's encouraging to me. My part is just to exalt God. And that's what Jacob did. And if for that one thing only, he's lifted up in Hebrews chapter 11. And in the end, Jacob believed God and exalted him. And that's what matters. That's the part that matters.